Athens, 399 BCE. A 70-year-old man walks into a room where 500 citizens have decided he must die. He didn't run. He had months to run. His friends arranged the escape, paid the right people, left the door open. He refused. He sat down. He heard the verdict. And then he asked to speak, not to plead, not to bargain, but to tell the men who condemned him that they had made a far greater mistake than they realized. The wisest man of the ancient world chose death. The question isn't why. The question is what he knew that we still don't. Before you go any further, make a decision. Are you going to watch this like everyone else and forget it? Or are you actually going to pay attention? If you chose the second option, subscribe now and hit the notification bell, because this story wasn't made to distract you. It was made to force you to think all the way to the end. Socrates never wrote a single line. Everything we know about him came from other people, students who admired him, rivals who despised him, a playwright who mocked him on stage while he was still alive to watch. And yet, 2,400 years later, his name is still synonymous with something most people have never actually practiced in their entire lives: real thinking. He was born in Athens around 470 BCE, the son of a sculptor and a midwife. He lived in the most intellectually vibrant city in the ancient world. He fought in wars. He had children. He refused money, refused power, refused silence. And it was precisely that silence Athens tried to buy, and that he refused to sell. Over the next 80 minutes, you'll understand why. And you'll realize that the story of Socrates isn't about death. It's about what it costs to live without lying. But before we get into his life, there's something you need to know. Socrates knew the men who condemned him. Some of them had been his students. Some of them had eaten at his table. The betrayal didn't come from outside. It came from within, and he knew it was coming. Imagine growing up in Athens in the 5th century BCE. Not the Athens of textbooks, not the concept, not the symbol, not the abstraction that centuries have turned into a kind of philosophical paradise, where white-robed men stroll between columns debating the nature of the good. The real Athens. The city that smells of salted fish and sun-baked leather in the August heat, where slaves have been hauling water since before dawn, where blacksmiths start work before sunrise, and the noise of the market begins so early it wakes children before their mothers. That is the city where Socrates is born. His father's name is Socrates. He is a sculptor, not the kind of artist later centuries romanticized, but a craftsman, a man who works stone with his hands, who knows the weight of marble and the angle of the chisel, who earns his living producing the votive figures Athenians offer at the temples. He is a middle-class man in the most precise sense of the term, neither rich nor poor, with enough standing for his son to attend the wrestling schools and gymnasiums where Athenian education took place, but without the fortune that makes philosophy a comfortable hobby. His mother's name is Phanerit. She is a midwife. This detail is not accidental. Socrates will return to it dozens of times throughout his life, the idea that his philosophical work is a form of intellectual midwifery, that he teaches no one anything because he has nothing to teach, that what he does is help others give birth to ideas that already exist inside them but that they cannot formulate on their own without assistance. The maieutic method, from the Greek maieutic, the art of the midwife, is the method that bears his mother's name. It is not a coincidence. It is a tribute. There is one biographical detail that later sources mention with a consistency historians debate without consensus. The young Socrates may have worked as a sculptor himself before devoting himself entirely to philosophy. Pausanias, the 2nd century geographer, claims to have seen near the road to the Acropolis a group of carved graces that tradition attributed to Socrates. The attribution is probably apocryphal, but the persistence of the legend says something about how later Athenians tried to reconcile the craftsman and the philosopher, as though the same hand that had shaped marble had afterward learned to shape arguments with the same precision and the same respect for the material. Socrates' childhood unfolds during a period of greatness and violence that rarely coexist with such intensity. Athens is at the peak of its power. The Persian Wars ended a generation ago. The victory at Marathon, the naval battle of Salamis, the resistance that transformed a city-state into a regional power, and what followed was a period of cultural and economic expansion the Mediterranean world had never seen before. Pericles is in power, the Parthenon is being built, the theatre of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides is transforming tragedy into a form of collective interrogation about the limits of the human. The Athenian democracy, imperfect, exclusionary toward women and slaves, but radically innovative for the citizens it included, is experimenting with forms of political participation no previous civilization had attempted. This is the world in which the young Socrates is formed. And what the world offers him, the grandeur, the optimism, the sense that Athens stands at the center of something historic, is precisely the kind of context that produces two types of people: those who absorb the greatness and reproduce it, and those who absorb the greatness and start asking inconvenient questions about it. Socrates is the second type. From an early age, those around him notice something difficult to name. It is not arrogance. Socrates does not carry himself like a man who considers himself superior. It is more a quality of attention, a way of listening that is also a way of pressing. A presence that makes conversations longer and more uncomfortable than people anticipated when they began them. There is also the matter of appearance. Socrates is, by all available accounts, ugly in a way that Athenians, who treated physical beauty as a moral category, found unsettling. Flat nose, bulging eyes, a protruding belly, a walk that Plato compares to that of a duck. In a culture that saw outward beauty as a reflection of inner beauty, Socrates' ugliness was itself a philosophical provocation, the embodied assertion that the exterior does not count, that what matters is within, that the soul has no visible form. He used his own appearance as an argument. It was already, in adolescence, the position of the man who would spend his entire life doing exactly that, turning everything he had, including what he lacked, into an instrument of interrogation. The formal education he receives is the standard education of a middle-class young Athenian: reading, writing, music, gymnastics. The sophists, the itinerant teachers who charge money to teach rhetoric and argumentation, are everywhere in the city, and Socrates listens to them, debates with them, learns their methods, and then spends the rest of his life dismantling them. Because what the sophists sell is the ability to argue any position with equal conviction, victory in debate, regardless of the truth of what is being defended. And for Socrates, this separation between argument and truth is not a pedagogical technique. It is the central problem of the civilization around him. War arrived before philosophy had time to fully take hold. In 432 BCE, Athens sent troops to Patadia, a colonial city in northern Greece that had decided to rebel against Athenian rule at a politically inconvenient moment. when the tensions between Athens and Sparta were turning the Greek world into a system of alliances that any spark could set ablaze. Socrates was 38 years old. He enlisted. This fact is systematically underestimated in narratives about Socrates, the philosopher who debates in the marketplace, the interrogator of politicians and poets, the man of words. But before all of that, and alongside all of that, Socrates was a soldier. He served as a hoplite, the Athenian heavy infantry, equipped with shield, spear, and bronze armor, fighting in close formation, where one man's cowardice could kill the men beside him. It was not a position for distracted philosophers. The Patadia campaign lasted 3 years. The conditions were brutal. The winters of northern Greece, that Athenians, accustomed to the Mediterranean climate, were not prepared for. Unstable supply lines. Diseases that killed more soldiers than combat did. Thucydides, the historian who lived through that period, describes the campaign with the dryness of someone who recorded too many deaths to enumerate them individually. Socrates survived. And not only survived, he was noticed. Alcibiades, the Athenian politician and general who would become one of the most controversial figures in Greek history decades later, served at Patadia and left an account of Socrates that Plato preserved in the Symposium. The account describes 2 things that define the military Socrates with a precision no subsequent biography has matched. The first is physical endurance. On a night of extreme winter cold, when the other soldiers wrapped themselves in everything they had and avoided leaving their tents, Socrates walked out barefoot into the snow and moved through it with the same indifference he showed in summer. It was not a display. It was not performative stoicism to impress his companions. It was simply the way his body responded to discomfort, or, more precisely, the way his mind had trained his body not to register discomfort as a priority. The second is stillness. At a certain point during the campaign, Alcibiades does not specify the exact occasion, only that it was during the day, in the sun. During a moment of relative tactical calm, Socrates stopped. He stood still for hours. The soldiers around him began to notice. Some stopped what they were doing to watch. Others brought their blankets and sat at a distance to see what would happen. Socrates remained motionless from dawn until the following sunrise, standing in the same spot, with the expression of someone solving an interior problem of a complexity the outside world cannot interrupt. In the morning, he greeted the sun, offered a brief prayer, and returned to camp. No one asked what had happened. What this episode reveals is not mysticism, though later centuries tried to turn it into that. It reveals the quality of concentration that defines Socrates, and that his contemporaries recognized as simultaneously admirable and unsettling. The ability to be completely inside a problem while the outside world continued its normal activity was, for Socrates, not a spiritual achievement but a functional necessity. It was how he thought. Patadia was also the setting for the second military episode the accounts preserve, the rescue of Alcibiades. In a battle in which the young general was wounded and at risk of being captured or killed, Socrates stayed by his side, shielded him while the others fell back, and ensured he left the battlefield alive and with his weapons, an important detail in a culture where losing one's shield was a permanent public disgrace. The irony that history has preserved is considerable. Socrates saved Alcibiades at Patadia. Alcibiades would, decades later, become one of the factors that precipitated Athens' distrust of the Socratic circle. The association between the philosopher and the most controversial politician of his generation would be used as an implicit argument in the trial that would condemn Socrates to death. The man he saved would come back to haunt him, But at Patadia, in 432, that was impossible to anticipate. There is a third episode from the campaign that the accounts mention with less detail but that historians identify as equally revealing. During a tactical retreat in which the Athenian formation was under pressure and there was a risk of a rout, Socrates was seen withdrawing with deliberate slowness, turning periodically to observe the enemy, maintaining an upright posture and a steady pace while the men around him quickened theirs. Alcibiades describes this scene as an example of what Socrates called presence of mind, not the courage that ignores danger, but the clarity that assesses it with enough precision to keep fear from replacing judgment. It was, here too, the method. The same quality that made the philosophical conversations unsettling made the soldier extraordinary. Socrates returned from the Patadia campaign in 429. The city he came back to was changing. The Peloponnesian War had begun the year before. The plague that would devastate Athens between 430 and 426 was in its early months. The world Socrates had left to go to war was not the world he returned to, and the man who returned was 40 years old, had watched companions die, and carried a growing certainty that there was something fundamentally wrong with the way Athens thought about itself. All that remained was to figure out what to do with that certainty. The answer would come from a place he did not expect. There is a paradox at the center of Socrates' life that no biography fully resolves. The man who spent his entire life insisting he knew nothing received, from the most respected oracle in the ancient world, the declaration that he was the wisest man in Athens. And rather than dismissing that declaration as absurd, which any genuinely humble man would have done, he spent the following decades investigating it with the seriousness of someone who had received a divine mission. The story begins with Cherephan. Cherephan had been a friend of Socrates since youth, a man described by contemporaries as enthusiastic to the point of recklessness, the kind of person who acts before thinking and thinks while acting. At some point during the 420s, Cherephan traveled to Delphi and put to the oracle of Apollo the question that would alter the trajectory of Socrates and, by extension, of Western philosophy. He asked whether there was any man wiser than Socrates. The oracle said no. Delphi was not, for Athenians, the equivalent of a horoscope or a popular divination consultation. It was the most respected religious institution in the Greek world, the point where mortals could, under specific circumstances and with the appropriate rituals, access the perspective of the gods on human affairs. States consulted Delphi before declaring war. Legislators consulted Delphi before enacting laws. The oracle's answers were taken seriously in a way that the 21st century has no easily accessible equivalent for. When Cherephan returned and told Socrates what the oracle had said, Socrates was troubled, not proud, troubled. The declaration was, for him, manifestly false, and this falseness was the problem. Because if the oracle of Apollo said something, and the oracle of Apollo did not lie, then there was a contradiction that needed to be resolved. Either Socrates was in fact the wisest man in Athens, which he knew to be impossible, since he knew nothing, or the word wise meant something different from what everyone assumed. He decided to investigate. The method was simple in conception and devastating in execution. Socrates identified the men Athens considered wise, the politicians, the poets, the craftsmen, the generals, the sophists, and spoke with them. Not to learn, to verify whether the wisdom their reputation attributed to them was real or merely reputation. What he found in each case was a variation of the same pattern. The politicians knew how to govern, or thought they did, but when questioned about the principles guiding their decisions, they revealed that they acted out of habit tradition, and the calculation of power. Without ever having examined whether the underlying principles were true or merely convenient, they knew how. They did not know why. The poets produced verses of a beauty that moved crowds, but when Socrates asked them what the verses meant, what they were saying, what truth they conveyed, the poets could not answer. They had created something they did not fully understand. Inspiration was not knowledge. It was something else, perhaps more valuable in certain respects, but different from knowing in a way that reason can examine and verify. The craftsmen were the most interesting cases. The craftsmen knew real things. A cobbler knew how to make shoes with a verifiable competence. Socrates respected this knowledge deeply. It was genuine, it was useful, it was honest. The problem was that the craftsmen, because they were skilled at one thing, assumed they also knew about everything else. Technical competence generated an epistemological confidence that expanded far beyond its legitimate limits, from the shoe to politics, from the temple to ethics. Each conversation confirmed the same conclusion. These men thought they knew things they did not know. And this difference between thinking one knows and actually knowing was, for Socrates, the source of nearly every error he witnessed around him. And it was here that Socrates understood what the oracle had said. His advantage over others was not that he knew more, it was that he knew he did not know. The others did not know and thought they did, which is infinitely more dangerous than simply not knowing. Socrates did not know and knew he did not know, which was, at minimum, an honest position from which real knowledge could eventually be built. This distinction, which sounds modest put this way, almost trivial, is in reality one of the most radical ideas anyone has produced in the history of human thought. Because it implies that the first condition for learning anything is recognizing that one does not know, and that the greatest resistance to learning is not ignorance, it is the illusion of knowledge that ignorance frequently produces. Socrates had found his mission. Not to teach, not to preach, not to build a school or write treatises, to walk through the city and ask questions. The mission had a cost that Socrates recognized with the same clarity with which he recognized its necessity. Every conversation that exposed the ignorance of a prominent man created an enemy, not immediately, not always in declared form, but with the silent persistence of resentment that finds no direct outlet. Socrates registered this cost in his own terms. His activity made him unpopular with many, and this unpopularity was the inevitable consequence of doing exactly what the oracle of Apollo had indicated was necessary. There was a cruel logic in this. Remaining faithful to the divine mission was methodically building the conditions for his own end. Socrates saw this logic. He continued anyway, because the alternative, stopping the questions to preserve personal safety, was the only betrayal he could not contemplate. It was service to Apollo. It was service to Athens. It was also, though not yet visible, the patient and methodical construction of a list of enemies who would one day have enough votes to kill him. Today, when someone asks an inconvenient question in a meeting, when they interrupt the comfortable consensus with an objection nobody wanted to hear, there is a name for that. We call it playing devil's advocate. It is an expression that normalizes discomfort, that turns it into technique, that strips it of seriousness by classifying it as rhetorical exercise. The implication is that the person doesn't necessarily believe what they're saying, they're just testing the argument, checking its resistance, playing a useful but temporary role that ends when the meeting does. Socrates was not playing devil's advocate. He believed every question he asked. And the questions did not end when the conversation did. They continued, returned, deepened, until the other person either had to admit they did not know what they thought they knew, or walked away with the specific anger of someone who had been exposed without having agreed to be exposed. The Athenian agora was the main stage, not by accident. The agora, the central public space of the city, where the marketplace, the courts, the temples, and political life overlapped in a continuity that modern cities have separated into distinct categories, was where Athenians went to be seen, to negotiate, to debate, to exercise the active citizenship democracy demanded. For Socrates, it was the perfect laboratory. The method had an elegance that later centuries tried to systematize without ever fully capturing. It always began with a seemingly simple question, the kind of question any intelligent person assumed they could answer without difficulty. What is courage? What is justice? What is piety? What is love? The other person would answer with the definition they considered obvious. Socrates would listen with genuine attention. Then he would ask a second question. Not a direct objection, a question that took the proposed definition and stretched it to the point where it began to reveal its internal contradictions. And so it continued, layer by layer, until the other person arrived at the point where the original definition they had proposed with such confidence turned out to be incomplete, or contradictory, or dependent on premises they could not defend when examined directly. The technical name for this method is elenchus, from the Greek, refutation through questioning. The name the other people used among themselves. At dinners and political gatherings, where Socrates was not present, was probably less technical and considerably less respectful, because the problem was not merely intellectual discomfort. It was the audience. The agora was not a private space. Socrates' conversations happened in front of anyone who wanted to stop and listen, and many people stopped, because there was a dramatic quality to those exchanges that Aeschylus' theatre did not fully surpass. Watching a famous politician, a respected general, a celebrated poet being methodically led to admit they did not know what they thought they knew was a spectacle Athens could not resist. The young were the most regular attendees. Sons of aristocratic families, Plato, Alcibiades, Charmides, and dozens of others followed Socrates through the city with a loyalty their fathers found increasingly troubling. Not because Socrates taught them subversive doctrines, but because Socratic conversations had a side effect no father of a young Athenian aristocrat wanted. They made the young men question their father's authority, not through direct incitement, through method. A young man who had spent an afternoon watching Socrates demonstrate that a famous general could not define courage went home with a different disposition toward accepting the certainties with which his father governed the household. The questioning did not stay in the agora, it entered the houses, and the fathers noticed. There was also the matter of money, or its absence. Socrates charged nothing for the conversations. He systematically refused any payment, which set him radically apart from the sophists, who charged considerable fees for their lessons. This refusal had a practical consequence. Socrates was poor. His wife, Xanthippe, described by contemporaries with a consistency that suggests the reputation was deserved. As one of the most difficult women to live with Athens had produced, raised the children on the family's meager resources. Socrates spent his days in the agora, talking with wealthy people about the nature of virtue while practical problems went unresolved at home. Xanthippe had reason for the impatience the accounts recorded, but Socrates continued. The relationship between Socrates and Xanthippe is one of the most misunderstood episodes in the entire Socratic biography. Tradition has preserved her almost exclusively as a symbol of the difficult woman, temperamental, demanding, incapable of appreciating the greatness of the man she lived with. This reading is probably unfair and certainly incomplete. Xanthippe was raising 3 children on scarce resources, while her husband spent his days charging nothing for his work. She was managing a household on whatever there was, which was little, and doing so while receiving a constant stream of young aristocrats who came to learn philosophy and left without making any material contribution to the family that had received them. The temperament that tradition recorded as a flaw was possibly the rational response of a woman to a situation that any sensible person would have found difficult. Socrates acknowledged this. He said he had chosen Xanthippe precisely because whoever learns to deal with her can deal with anyone, because there was something in Athens that troubled him more and more deeply, a growing superficiality in public discourse, a tendency to confuse eloquence with wisdom, appearance with substance, success with virtue. Athenian democracy was producing leaders extraordinarily skilled at persuasion and extraordinarily incapable of thought, and nobody seemed to notice. Or if they noticed, they didn't say so. Socrates said so. Socrates convinced me that my life wasn't worth living until I examined who I was. And I never forgave him for it. Nobody said exactly this, but it could have been said by dozens of men who crossed Socrates' path during the decades he walked the Athenian agora with his questions. Men who entered the conversation with a reputation and left it with a doubt. Men who were exposed in public without having agreed to be exposed. Men who carried home the discomfort that Socratic questions produced, and who never found a way to resolve it. These men accumulated over decades, and they had long memories. The first group of enemies were the politicians. Athens in the late 5th century was a democracy under mounting tension. The Peloponnesian War had begun in 431 and showed no signs of quick resolution. Resources were being consumed by a military campaign that extended far beyond what any initial planning had anticipated. And political discourse had taken on the specific quality of moments when societies are under pressure and leaders need certainties they do not have. Socrates provided the opposite of certainties. In a period when Athens needed to believe in its institutions, its leaders, the justice of its wars, Socrates walked through the city methodically demonstrating that the leaders did not know what they were doing, that the institutions rested on unexamined premises, that collective certainty was frequently collective illusion. It was the worst possible moment for this service. The second group were the poets and artists. Socrates' relationship with creativity was complicated in a way that later centuries tried to simplify without success. He did not despise art, he recognized its beauty, its emotional power, its ability to move people in ways that rational argument could not. What he questioned was the epistemic status of art, the idea that the poet, by producing something beautiful, had privileged access to truth. When he demonstrated that poets could not explain what their own verses meant, he was not attacking the beauty of the verses. He was attacking the authority that Athenian culture automatically conferred on its creators. It was a distinction the poets did not appreciate. The third group, and the most dangerous in the long run, was that of successful craftsmen and merchants, whom Socrates had demonstrated knew less than they thought. These men did not have the philosophical refinement to articulate exactly why conversations with Socrates left them unsettled. They only knew they had entered the conversation with a reputation and left it with a doubt. The confidence Socrates took from them was not false. It was necessary. A craftsman needs to believe in what he does in order to do it well. A merchant needs to believe in his judgments to execute them at the speed the market demands. The philosophical doubt Socrates installed was genuinely useful for those who had the time and inclination to work through it, and genuinely destructive for those who had neither. There was also Aristophanes. Athens' most talented comic playwright premiered in 423 a play called The Clouds that placed Socrates at the center. Not the real Socrates, but a caricatured version that blended the ideas of the sophists. Socrates was actually combating with an eccentric lunacy that made the character simultaneously ridiculous and vaguely threatening. In the play, Socrates runs an absurd school called the Thinkery, floats in a suspended basket to be closer to the clouds where thought resides, and teaches young men to use argumentation to escape moral and legal responsibility, the exact opposite of what the real Socrates did. The play was a hit. The audience laughed. And the problem with a well-executed caricature is that it sticks. The image of Socrates as an eccentric sophist who teaches young men to question authority entered the popular imagination of Athens with a persistence that decades of serious philosophical conversations could not fully erase. When, 24 years later, Socrates was put on trial, one of the accusers explicitly referenced the clouds as a source of information about the defendant's character. A comedy contributed to the death sentence of a philosopher. Art has consequences that artists don't always anticipate. But Socrates' most dangerous enemy was none of these. It was the entire city, the version of itself that Athens had built over decades of greatness, and that Socrates threatened to dismantle not with violence or politics, but with questions that forced it to see the distance between what it claimed to be and what it actually was. Socrates was the mirror that showed this distance. The mirror is a metaphor Socrates never used for himself, but that his interlocutors used, in private, to describe the effect of conversations with him. There is something specific about being forced to see the gap between what you claim to be and what you actually are, an experience most people avoid with an energy they normally reserve for external threats. Socrates did not allow this evasion. Not because he was cruel. The accounts are unanimous in describing a genuine gentleness in the Socratic method, an attentiveness that did not humiliate but also did not protect. It was a form of respect that treated the other person as an adult capable of bearing the truth about themselves. The problem was that most interlocutors did not see themselves this way. They saw themselves as already sufficiently honest, already sufficiently wise, already sufficiently examined. And Socrates' refusal to confirm this self-image was experienced not as respect, but as attack. And Athens did not want to see what the mirror showed. The war Athens thought it was going to win was ending in the worst possible way. Not in a decisive battle where defeat was clear and the lesson immediate, but in the slow and humiliating way long wars end for those who lose them through exhaustion. Accumulated errors, decisions made under pressure that seemed reasonable at the time and that history transformed into catastrophes. The Peloponnesian War had begun in 431 with Athens at the height of its power. 25 years later, in 406, that power had evaporated. The Sicilian expedition of 415, the most ambitious and most disastrous decision Athenian democracy ever made, had consumed the largest military fleet Athens had ever assembled. The idea was to extend Athenian dominion into the western Mediterranean, conquer Syracuse, create a power base that would make Athens invincible. The plan was approved by the assembly with the enthusiasm democracies reserve for adventures that promise glory without visible cost. The cost became visible quickly. The expedition was a total disaster. The fleet was destroyed. The soldiers who did not die in combat died in the stone quarries of Syracuse, where they were kept as slaves. Of the 45,000 men who set out, a tiny fraction returned. Athens lost in one campaign what it had accumulated over generations, and the war continued. Because stopping meant admitting that everything had been for nothing, and democracies at war have a particular difficulty making that admission when the dead are numerous enough that defeat feels like an insult to their memory. Socrates watched. Not in silence, never in silence, but with the restraint of someone who recognizes that there are moments when the questions he would normally ask in the agora carry a different weight. The city was dying slowly, and the men who had led to this point were precisely the men he had spent decades demonstrating did not know what they were doing. There was a specific episode in 406 that crystallized everything. Following the Battle of Arginusi, a naval victory for Athens, the Athenian generals were accused of failing to recover the bodies of soldiers lost at sea. The assembly decided to try the 6 generals present in Athens as a group, a single collective trial for all of them, instead of individual trials as the law clearly required. Socrates was that day one of the Prytaneas, the members of the executive council who presided over the assembly's sessions. He refused to sign the order for the collective trial. Alone among the Prytaneas, he declared the procedure illegal and said he would not participate in it, regardless of the pressure applied. The assembly was in a fury. Threats were made. Pressure was applied. Socrates did not yield. The generals were tried collectively, convicted, and executed. Months later, when the emotion had cooled enough to allow thought, Athens acknowledged that the procedure had been illegal and that the generals had been unjustly condemned. Socrates did not say he had told them so. What mattered was not personal vindication. It was the lesson the city should have learned, and clearly had not, that collective pressure does not turn an illegal procedure into a legal one, that the emotional intensity of an assembly is not an argument, that democracy only functions when its procedures are respected, even when, especially when, respecting them is unpopular. Athens did not learn the lesson. In 405, the Athenian fleet was destroyed at the Battle of Aegospotami. Sparta had won the war. In 404, Athens' long walls were torn down to the sound of flutes, while Sparta's allies celebrated. What followed was the oligarchy of the 30 tyrants. Sparta installed in Athens a regime of 30 men that governed for 8 months with a brutality contemporaries described as exceeding anything a direct foreign occupation could have produced. 1,500 citizens were executed. The methods of the 30 were not merely brutal, they were calculated to produce the specific kind of fear that paralyzes resistance before it can organize. The executions were public and arbitrary enough to communicate that no one was safe. But they always came with a formal justification: debts, treason charges, suspicions of democratic conspiracy that allowed the regime to deny the systematic terror that observers identified immediately. Critias, the leader of the 30 and a former student of Socrates, had understood something that less sophisticated tyrants do not, that fear is most effective when it has an apparent logic. When the victims can imagine they might have avoided their fate had they acted differently. This understanding was, in a certain sense, philosophical. It was the elenchus applied to terror, the Socratic method of revealing contradictions, used not to produce wisdom but to produce submission. And Socrates continued to walk through the city. Not because he was courageous in the way soldiers are courageous, but because stopping would mean admitting that there were circumstances under which that pursuit of truth should be suspended for reasons of political convenience. And that was an admission Socrates was not willing to make. There is a paradox at the heart of Socrates' behavior during the regime of the 30 tyrants that his defenders rarely examine with the attention it deserves. The man who had spent decades implicitly defending Athenian democracy through every question he asked about the nature of justice and virtue, did not join the resistance when democracy was overthrown. He did not flee. He did not organize. He did not conspire with the Democrats, who had taken refuge in Piraeus, to plan their return. He stayed in Athens. He kept walking through the city. He kept asking questions. The explanation Plato preserves is consistent with everything we know about Socrates, but remains profoundly unsatisfying for those who expect philosophical integrity to translate automatically into political action. Socrates did not see politics as the domain where his mission operated. He saw it as the domain where his mission was most necessary and most dangerous, which is not the same thing. The 30 were led by Critias. Critias had been a student of Socrates. This fact is one of the most uncomfortable in the entire Socratic biography, and also one of the most important for understanding why the charges of 399 were possible. Critias was not an accidental tyrant. He was a man of considerable philosophical formation, a poet, a thinker, someone who had spent enough time in Socrates' company to absorb the methods without absorbing the principles. The question of how far a teacher is responsible for what students do with what they learn is one of the hardest questions in the ethics of education. Socrates faced it in its most extreme form. A man who had learned to question authority from him used that ability to install a regime of terror. The 30 gave Socrates a specific order. The order was to go and bring in Leon of Salamis, an Athenian citizen with no apparent guilt, for execution. It was the kind of order the regime gave regularly to test the complicity of prominent citizens. Socrates refused. Not with a speech, not with a philosophical declaration. He simply turned around and went home while the other 4 men sent with him went to carry out the order. Leon of Salamis was executed. Socrates survived the regime, not because the 30 spared him out of philosophical admiration, but because the regime fell before it had time to deal with all the refusals it had accumulated. The democratic resistance led by Thrasybulus recaptured Athens in 403. The 30 were deposed. Critias died in combat, and democracy was restored with a general amnesty. The amnesty made it technically illegal to prosecute crimes directly related to the period of the 30. When Anytus, Miletus, and Lycon decided to prosecute Socrates in 399, they needed to build a charge that did not formally violate the amnesty but that took advantage of the climate of distrust the period had created. The charge they settled on was simultaneously precise and vague enough to be useful. Socrates was charged with failing to acknowledge the gods the city acknowledged, with introducing new divine beings, and with corrupting the youth. The religious charge was the weakest intellectually and the most powerful politically. Socrates had mentioned throughout decades a daemonion, an inner voice that warned him when he was about to do something wrong. The accusers turned this honesty into evidence of religious heterodoxy. The corruption of youth charge was the most honest of the 3, in the sense that there was a real basis for it. Even if the word corruption was the wrong framing, the question was whether questioning authority was corruption or education. The answer depended on who was answering. For the fathers whose sons had come home with inconvenient questions, it was corruption. For the sons who had come home with the questions, It was the beginning of something they did not yet have words for. There was also a dimension that the formal charges could not directly capture, but that was present in every Athenian courtroom conversation about the case. Socrates' association with Alcibiades had been the most brilliant and most destructive politician of his generation, a man of extraordinary talent who had used that talent to become successively a traitor to Athens, a collaborator of Sparta, an ally of Persia, and a restored hero of Athenian democracy, before dying in exile in an obscure diplomatic intrigue. His career was the most powerful argument against Socrates that no accuser needed to formulate explicitly. Simply mentioning the name was enough to let the association do the work. Socrates had been the mentor of the man whose outsized ambition had contributed to the Sicilian catastrophe. What kind of philosophical education produced this result? The question hung in the air over the courtroom without needing to be answered. The trial was set. Athens was going to decide what to do with the most inconvenient man it had ever produced. Wait. Before we enter the trial, there's something you need to understand that most narratives about Socrates leave out entirely. Socrates could have escaped. Not after the sentence, before it. His accusers expected him to flee. The city expected him to flee. There was an unofficial but widely recognized procedure in Athens by which a citizen charged with a capital crime left for exile before the trial, and the matter was considered settled for all parties. Socrates knew this. He chose to appear. The question nobody asks is, why? The answer will change the way you understand everything that follows. Today, when a democracy prosecutes someone for their ideas, there is a name for it. We call it political persecution. We recognize it immediately, the charge framed in legal language, but motivated by reasons the law cannot directly name. The judicial process used as an instrument to eliminate an inconvenient voice without the political cost of silencing it by decree. Athens in 399 did not have this vocabulary, but it had the mechanism. Anytus was the chief architect of the prosecution. He was not a minor figure, he was one of the leaders of the democratic restoration, a successful tanner who had risked his fortune and his life in the resistance against the 30 tyrants, and who had returned to Athens with the moral authority of those who had fought when fighting was dangerous. He was also, according to Plato, the father of a young man who had spent considerable time in Socrates' company and who had consequently developed a complicated relationship with paternal authority. Anytus had personal reasons and political reasons. The political reasons were the most important and the most difficult to articulate directly. Athens, in 399, was a traumatized city that needed to rebuild. The war had ended in defeat. The regime of the 30 had left scars that the amnesty made it illegal to process directly, but could not erase from collective memory. The restored democracy needed stability. It needed citizens who believed in the institutions, who respected the city's gods, who taught their children to respect authority and tradition. Socrates was the opposite of all of this. Not out of malice, not out of political program, but by method, the systematic questioning of everything the city needed its citizens to accept without question. Miletus was the formal accuser, an obscure young poet whom Plato describes with a contempt, suggesting he considered him a tool in Anytus's hands more than an independent agent. It was Miletus who had formally deposited the charge in the city's archives. Lycon was the third accuser, an orator associated with the interests of the sophists, which made his participation in a prosecution of Socrates an irony contemporaries certainly did not miss. The formal charge read as follows: Socrates is guilty of failing to acknowledge the gods the city acknowledges and of introducing new divine beings. He is also guilty of corrupting the youth. The proposed penalty is death. Every word of this charge had been chosen with care. The reference to new divine beings was an allusion to the daemonian. Turning an honestly described inner experience into evidence of religious heterodoxy was legally creative and politically effective because it was irrefutable. Socrates had said the words. The words were recorded in the memories of hundreds of witnesses. The corruption of youth charge was simultaneously the vaguest and the most resonant. Vague because corruption was not defined. Resonant because there were 500 men in Athens who could recall specific conversations in which Socrates had questioned specific authorities in front of specific young men. The trial was not abstract. It was personal for a considerable fraction of the jury. Socrates was notified of the charges and given the standard period to prepare his defense. He did not hire a logographer, one of the professional speechwriters who made up the legal industry of Athens and who could have built a rhetorically effective defense. He decided to speak for himself. What he prepared was not a defense in the sense the court expected. It was a continuation of the conversations he had been having in the agora for 30 years, the same honesty, the same refusal of flattery, the same refusal to say what the other person wanted to hear instead of what he considered true. In an Athenian court, this approach had a considerable disadvantage. Athenian courts did not want truth in the Socratic sense. They wanted a performance, the public demonstration that the accused recognized the court's authority, respected the judges, understood the gravity of the situation. Socrates was not willing to make those concessions, not because he was arrogant, or not only because of that, but because making those concessions would mean admitting that there were circumstances under which honesty should yield to convenience. And that admission contradicted everything he had defended throughout his life in a way that made condemnation preferable to contradiction. There was also a practical dimension to the refusal to hire a logographer that modern commentators rarely examine. Athenian logographers were experienced professionals who knew the juries, knew the emotional response patterns, knew which arguments worked and which did not in specific cases. A competent logographer could have built a defense that did not compromise Socrates' principles, but that presented them in a way the jury could absorb without feeling attacked. Socrates knew this. The refusal to hire a logographer was not naivety. It was the conscious choice to face the court exactly as he had faced every interlocutor in the agora. Without mediation, without rhetorical cushioning, with the direct honesty he considered the only form of communication worth practicing. It was also, he recognized, the choice that made condemnation more likely. He made it, anyway. The day of the trial arrived. Imagine you are in Athens in the first month of spring, 399 BC. The court convenes in an open space near the agora, not an enclosed building with the architectural solemnity that the 21st century associates with justice, but an outdoor space where 501 Athenian citizens sat on wooden benches in the morning sun with their bronze voting tokens in hand and the awareness that this day was going to be recorded in a way they could not yet fully anticipate. The defendant enters. He is 70 years old. He walks with the same indifference to others' gaze he has always carried, barefoot, as always, in the simple tunic that had been his recognizable mark throughout the city. There is no visible nervousness. There is none of the submissive posture the court expects from someone facing a capital charge. Socrates looks at the court with the same attention he gave to interlocutors in the agora. As if this were just another conversation, the accusers speak first. Anytus, Miletus, and Lycon present the arguments they had prepared: the religious heterodoxy, the introduction of new divine beings, the systematic corruption of Athenian youth over decades. The speeches are competent, built with the rhetoric that sophistic education had refined over generations. Then it is Socrates' turn. What follows is one of the most extraordinary documents antiquity produced, preserved by Plato in the Apology, with the caveat that Plato was present at the trial, and that the Apology was written years later, with all the problems of memory and interpretation that entails. Socrates begins by warning the court that he will speak differently from what they are used to hearing in a courtroom. He will not use the elaborate rhetoric of prepared speeches. He will not adorn his arguments with figures of speech calculated to move emotions. He will speak as he always speaks, directly, with the words the situation demands, and not the words the audience would prefer to hear. This warning is itself a provocation, because, in an Athenian court, saying you will not use rhetoric is a rhetorical statement. It establishes from the outset that you are the kind of man who tells the truth while others manipulate. Socrates probably knew this, and said it anyway. The defense he presents does not contest the facts of the charges. It contests the interpretation. Yes, he speaks of a daemonian, but the daemonian is not a new divine being. Yes, young men follow his conversations, but they follow because the conversations are genuinely useful, because the examined life is what makes life worth living. And then he says something the court did not expect. He describes his mission in Athens not as a personal choice, but as divine service, the gadfly that stings the sleeping horse, the necessary irritant that keeps the city awake and thinking when comfort and success invite it to sleep. Without him, Athens will fall asleep. It is simultaneously the most honest defense and the most disastrous strategy an accused man could adopt, because it compares the jury to a sleeping horse. The vote on guilt takes place. 280 votes against 221. Socrates is found guilty by a margin of 59 votes in a jury of 501. A relatively narrow margin suggesting the city was genuinely divided. The penalty phase follows. The Athenian system allowed the convicted defendant to propose an alternative penalty to the one the accusers had proposed. The accusers had proposed death. Socrates proposes to be fed at public expense in the Prytaneum, the honor reserved for Olympic athletes and victorious generals. The court falls silent. Then, pressed by his friends, Socrates proposes a fine of 30 minas. It is a serious offer. It is also, in the way it is presented, clearly reluctant. The jury votes a second time, 360 votes for death, 141 for the fine. The margin grew. 80 jurors who had voted for acquittal now voted for death, offended not by Socrates' guilt, but by the way he had responded to his conviction. Socrates is sentenced to death. He asks to speak one last time. What he said in that final address is one of the most extraordinary texts ancient literature produced. He spoke to the 501 men who had condemned him, not with bitterness, not with supplication, but with the specific serenity of someone who had reached the end of an examined life and found nothing that needed to be hidden. He told them that the death they had given him was a lesser evil than the disgrace of having sought acquittal by betraying his principles. He told them that those who condemned him would not escape judgment, not the judgment of the gods, but the judgment of history, which would treat the condemnation of Socrates as the clearest evidence of what a democracy does when it is afraid of the truth. And he told them, finally, that he did not know whether death was a good or an evil. but that he knew betraying his mission was unquestionably an evil, and that between an uncertainty and a certainty, the choice was simple. We were all there, and none of us could believe what we were seeing. Phaedo of Elis wrote this decades later. He was one of the friends present in Socrates' cell on the last day, one of the men Plato placed in the dialogue that bears Phaedo's name, the most detailed document we have of Socrates' final hours, which is simultaneously a philosophical treatise on the immortality of the soul and an eyewitness account of how a man prepares to die with a serenity those around him could not replicate. The interval between the conviction and the execution had lasted 30 days. Not out of clemency, out of the calendar. A sacred embassy had departed for Delos the day before the trial, and Athenian law prohibited executions while the embassy was traveling. Socrates spent 30 days in prison, receiving daily visits, continuing his philosophical conversations with the regularity that had characterized his entire adult life. His friends organized an escape. Crito, one of Socrates' oldest and most loyal friends, presented the plan with the urgency of someone who had spent days working out the details. The guards had been paid. The route was established. Destinations were available. Thessaly, where Crito had contacts, where Socrates could live out his remaining days in relative comfort. Socrates heard the plan in full. He refused. The dialogue Plato preserves, the Crito, is the clearest exposition of the reasoning Socrates used to refuse the escape. The argument is not religious. It is not emotional. It is contractual. Socrates had lived 70 years in Athens. He had benefited from the city's laws, the protection they offered, the education they permitted, the freedom of movement and expression they guaranteed. This permanence was a form of implicit contract. He had agreed, by his presence and by his life, to respect the city's laws. To flee now would be to violate that contract. Not because the conviction was just. Socrates never admitted the conviction was just, but because the justice or injustice of a specific sentence does not give a citizen the right to disobey the legal system they had accepted as their own. It was an argument that subsequent centuries would debate endlessly. It is still being debated today. The morning of the execution arrived. His friends gathered in the cell from dawn. Xantippe was there with the youngest child in her arms, and Socrates asked that she be taken home, not out of coldness, but because her weeping made it harder to maintain the kind of conversation he wanted to have in his final hours. The conversation of the final hours was about the immortality of the soul. Not as comfort, Socrates did not use philosophy as anesthesia, as genuine inquiry. If the soul is immortal, death is not the end but a transition. If the soul is not immortal, death is the end of all experience, and in that case there is also reason for equanimity, because what does not exist cannot suffer. In either case, panic is unjustified. It was, until the end, the method. The executioner arrived with the cup of hemlock late in the afternoon. He brought it with an expression Phaedo describes as genuinely troubled, the man who had executed many condemned prisoners and had never encountered one who prepared for death this way. Socrates took the cup. His friends wept. Socrates asked them to compose themselves, not out of insensitivity but because their weeping made it harder to die with the dignity he had chosen. He drank the hemlock with the same indifference with which he had walked barefoot through the snow at Patadia. He walked around the cell until he felt his legs grow heavy. He lay down. The cold was rising. The last words Plato records are directed to Crito, a debt of a rooster owed to Asclepius, the god of medicine, that needed to be paid. It was a final ritual gesture, the assurance that religious obligations had been met. Crito asked if there was anything else. There was no answer. Socrates had died with the same quality of presence with which he had lived, completely inside the moment. Without drama, without visible regret, without the anxiety that most human beings experience when they face what he had spent 30 years examining. Phaedo wrote that he was the wisest and most just man he had ever known, and then fell silent. Because there were things for which words were insufficient, and Socrates had spent his life insisting on not saying things for which words were insufficient. Phaedo's silence is the most honest final note the philosophical tradition has found for this story. Plato, who was present that day, chose not to include his own reactions in the account. A silence, within a silence, that later readers filled with everything they needed to be there. What is certain is that the years following Socrates' death were devoted entirely by Plato to recording, interpreting, and expanding Socrates' conversations, a body of work of a scale and quality that has no parallel in the history of philosophy. It is not an exaggeration to say that Western philosophy is, in large part, Plato's attempt to ensure that Socrates did not die in vain, and that this attempt produced, paradoxically, exactly what Socrates would have refused: a body of written doctrine, a system, a school, an authority. The ultimate irony is that the man who refused to write became, through those who loved him, the most influential author antiquity produced. It was the final lesson. Socrates never wrote a single line, and yet he gave rise to Plato, who gave rise to Aristotle, who gave rise to virtually all of subsequent Western philosophy. The irony is structural. The man who distrusted writing as a means of preserving thought became the central character in some of the most widely read texts in human history. The charge of corrupting the youth produced the opposite of its intended effect. Athens executed Socrates and immortalized him at the same time, and the question he asked in the Agora, "Is the unexamined life worth living?" remains without a definitive answer. It is still being asked. What Socrates knew that others did not know was not a secret. It was the opposite of a secret. It was something he repeated in public, every day, to anyone who stopped to listen. That the unexamined life is not worth living. That ignorance, disguised as knowledge, is the greatest danger a society faces. That there are things worth more than survival. Athens killed him for saying this, and then spent the following centuries quoting him. The contradiction is not Socrates. It is ours. If this story made you think, do one thing right now. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Leave a like if you made it this far. Share it with someone who needed to hear this. Stories like this take time to build. Your support is what keeps them alive.